What would you do if the child you raised with your own two hands looked you in the eye and told you that you no longer belonged in your own home? My name is Edward Bennett, and at 72 years old, I had to answer that question myself. Before I go further, if stories like this move you, if you believe that people who work hard their whole lives deserve respect in their final years, hit that like button right now. Subscribe if you have not already, and share this with someone who needs to hear it today. It costs you nothing, but it means everything to me that you are here. Now, let me tell you what happened. I grew up in a small town where nobody had much, but everybody had each other. My father worked in a factory that made engine parts, and my mother cleaned houses for families who lived on the better side of town. I learned early that nothing in life came free. I learned it from watching my father's hands, cracked and rough, and from watching my mother count coins on the kitchen table late at night. By the time I turned 18, I already knew what kind of man I wanted to be. Not rich, not famous, just steady, reliable, the kind of man who keeps his word and pays his debts. I took a job at a construction company, carrying bricks and mixing cement under the hot sun. I was not the strongest man on the site, but I was the last one to leave every single day. Years passed. I worked my way up from laborer to supervisor to site manager. Every promotion came with more responsibility, more hours, and a little more money saved in the bank. I met a woman named Margaret at a community dance when I was 26. She had a laugh that made strangers smile, and eyes that made me forget every worry I carried. We married a year later in a small church with folding chairs and homemade flowers. Together, Margaret and I dreamed of a home. Not a mansion, just a place with a solid roof, a warm kitchen, and a yard big enough for children to run in. It took us 9 years of saving every spare dollar, skipping vacations, and repairing our old car instead of replacing it. But in the end, we bought a modest 2-story house on a quiet street lined with oak trees. I still remember the day we got the keys. I stood in the empty living room, held Margaret's hand, and told her this house would be our legacy. 2 years later, our daughter was born. We named her Claire. I still remember the first time I held her in the hospital room. She was so small that her entire hand fit around just one of my fingers. In that moment, I made a silent promise. I would give this child everything I never had. I would work harder, save more, and make sure she never went to bed hungry or afraid. For the next 20 years, I kept that promise. I worked overtime whenever the company offered it. I skipped my own birthday dinners to save money for Claire's school fees. When Claire wanted to study business in college, I took on a second job as a night security guard just to cover the tuition gap. Margaret worked as a seamstress from home, stitching late into the night while Claire slept upstairs, unaware of the sacrifices being made just one floor below her. Claire grew into a bright, ambitious young woman. She graduated with honors and landed a job at a marketing firm in the city. Margaret and I were proud beyond words. We framed her graduation photo and hung it in the living room, right above the fireplace, where every visitor could see it. But life has a way of testing even the strongest families. When Claire was 29, Margaret was diagnosed with a heart condition. The doctors said it was manageable with medication and rest, but 2 years later, on a quiet Tuesday morning, Margaret passed away in her sleep. I woke up beside her and knew, before I even checked, that she was gone. The house that once echoed with laughter suddenly felt too large and too silent. I spent months walking from room to room, touching things Margaret had touched, trying to feel her presence in the curtains she sewed and the garden she planted. Claire moved back home for a while to help me grieve, and for those months, I felt like maybe things could still be okay. That is where the story most people think they know begins. But the real story, the one that matters, started quietly, almost invisibly, in the years that followed. Claire's marketing job was unstable. The company downsized twice, and each time, she found herself unemployed for months. She had debts from a business venture that failed, credit cards maxed out from a lifestyle she could not quite afford, and a growing sense of desperation that she hid well behind a confident smile. Being a father who never stopped loving his daughter, I offered to help. I paid off a portion of her credit card debt. I gave her money for rent when she moved into a new apartment. Every time Claire called with a problem, I found a way to solve it, dipping into my retirement savings a little more each time, telling myself it was temporary, telling myself that a father should always help his child. What I did not know was that Claire had started seeing a man named Trevor Hayes, a smooth-talking investor who convinced her that real wealth came from real estate. Trevor filled her head with ideas about property value, refinancing, and leveraging assets. He was charming in the way that con men often are, always polite, always confident, always one step ahead of the people he was manipulating. It was Trevor who first planted the idea in Claire's mind. "Your father owns his house outright," he told her one evening over dinner. "No mortgage, no debt. That house is sitting there worth a fortune, and he is just an old man living alone in it. Imagine what you could do with that kind of equity." At first, Claire pushed the thought away. This was her father, the man who taught her to ride a bicycle, who sat through every school play even after 12-hour shifts, who never once made her feel like a burden. But desperation has a way of eroding conscience, slowly, one justification at a time. A few weeks later, Claire visited me with a plan already forming in her mind. She told me she was worried about my safety living alone in such a big house. She told me it would be easier, financially and emotionally, if the house was transferred into her name, just for tax purposes, just to protect the family legacy from complications down the road. She used soft words like protect and simplify and family. She never once said the word control. I trusted my daughter completely. I had no reason not to. So when Claire brought papers for me to sign, papers she said her lawyer friend had prepared, I signed them without reading every line carefully. Why would I suspect my own daughter? I had spent my entire life protecting her. It never crossed my mind that she might one day need protecting from herself, or from the man whispering in her ear. Within a year, the ownership of the house had fully transferred to Claire's name. I did not think much of it at the time. I still lived there. I still paid the utility bills. I still tended the garden Margaret had planted decades earlier. On the surface, nothing seemed different. But something had shifted, quietly, permanently. Trevor's influence grew stronger. He convinced Claire to take out a loan against the house to fund a new business venture, something involving imported furniture that promised quick returns. Claire, blinded by the hope of finally proving herself successful, agreed. The loan went through. The business failed within 8 months. The debt remained. By this point, Claire needed more than just money. She needed the house itself, fully, without my presence complicating the paperwork or the plans Trevor kept suggesting. Sell it, rent it out, refinance it again. The ideas kept coming, each one requiring me to somehow disappear from the equation. That is when the visits started changing. Claire's tone became sharper. She started commenting on how the house was too big for one old man. She started asking why I needed so much space when I barely used half the rooms. She started suggesting, casually at first, that maybe it was time to consider assisted living. I brushed off these comments as nothing more than a daughter's concern. I told myself Claire was stressed from work. I told myself things would settle down. I held on to the version of my daughter I had known my entire life, refusing to see the version standing in front of me now. Now, before I go deeper into this story, I want to ask you something. Have you or someone you know ever trusted a family member completely, only to be blindsided later? Type one word in the comments below to let me know you are still here, still listening, still believing that stories like mine deserve to be told. And if this story has already touched something in you, share it with someone right now. Someone out there needs this reminder today. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday evening in October. Claire arrived at the house with Trevor by her side, something she had never done before. I greeted them politely, offering coffee, unaware that this visit would change everything. Claire sat down across from me and, without much warm-up, told me that she and Trevor had decided to convert the upper floor of the house into a rental unit. She explained, in a voice that sounded rehearsed, that the extra income would help cover the mounting debts. She told me I would need to move my belongings out of the master bedroom, the room I had shared with Margaret for over 30 years, and relocate to the basement. I sat in stunned silence. The basement was unfinished, cold, with a single small window near the ceiling and a bathroom that had not been properly renovated in over a decade. It was where we stored old furniture and boxes of Christmas decorations, not where a human being was meant to live. I asked Claire if she was serious. She said yes. I asked her how she could ask this of her own father, in his own house. That is when Claire said words I will never forget. She told me it was not my house anymore. It was hers, and if I did not like the arrangement, I was welcome to find somewhere else to live. Trevor sat quietly, watching, a faint satisfaction hidden behind a neutral expression. He had gotten exactly what he wanted. Claire, meanwhile, avoided my eyes, perhaps because some small part of her still knew this was wrong, but that part had grown too weak to stop what was already in motion. I did not argue further that night. I was 72 years old, tired, heartbroken, and utterly blindsided. I simply nodded, stood up, and walked to the room I had shared with my late wife. I packed my clothes into 2 suitcases, took down the photo of Margaret from the nightstand, and carried my belongings down the narrow basement stairs alone, while my daughter watched from the kitchen and said nothing. That first night in the basement, I sat on an old cot that used to belong to a guest bedroom, surrounded by boxes and cold concrete walls. I looked at the photo of Margaret and whispered an apology, though I had done nothing wrong. I apologized for not protecting our home better. I apologized for trusting too easily. I cried for the first time since Margaret's funeral, quietly, so Claire would not hear me through the floorboards above. The weeks that followed were difficult beyond words. My meals became irregular, since Claire rarely thought to include me when she cooked upstairs. The basement had no proper heating, and as autumn turned into a harsh winter, I wrapped myself in old blankets just to sleep through the night. My health, already fragile from years of manual labor, began to decline. My knees ached constantly from the cold concrete floor. My hands, once strong enough to lay bricks for 12 hours straight, now trembled slightly in the mornings. Claire rarely came downstairs to check on me. When she did, it was usually to ask me to keep quiet because tenants were viewing the upstairs unit, or to remind me that my portion of the utility costs was due. She spoke to her own father the way a landlord speaks to a difficult tenant, distant, transactional, without warmth. Neighbors began to notice something was wrong. Mrs. Patterson, who lived 2 houses down and had known me since I first moved onto the street, noticed that I no longer sat on the porch in the mornings drinking my coffee like I used to. She noticed the lights in the upper floor changing, new curtains appearing, unfamiliar cars parked outside. When she asked Claire about it during a chance encounter at the grocery store, Claire brushed her off, saying her father was fine, just adjusting to some family changes. But I was not fine. I was slowly disappearing, both from the house I built and from the life I once lived. I stopped going to the community center where I used to play chess with old friends. I stopped calling my brother, embarrassed by what had become of me. I spent my days in that basement, staring at the small window near the ceiling, watching feet walk past on the sidewalk outside, feeling more invisible with each passing week. One evening, while searching through an old box for a warmer sweater, I found something that would change everything. Tucked beneath a stack of old tax documents was a folder I did not recognize, one that must have fallen from Claire's bag during one of her rare visits downstairs. Inside were printed emails between Claire and Trevor, discussing plans to eventually sell the house entirely once my presence became, as one email chillingly put it, no longer a factor. I read every page with trembling hands. The emails detailed a plan that had been in motion for over a year, long before I was ever asked to move to the basement. They spoke about isolating me from friends and family to reduce interference. They spoke about wearing me down slowly so that moving me into a care facility would seem like my own idea rather than something forced upon me. They even discussed, in cold financial terms, the market value of the house once it was empty and ready to sell. For the first time since that rainy Thursday in October, I felt something other than sadness. I felt clarity. I felt the same steady determination that had carried me through decades of hard labor, through raising a daughter with my own calloused hands, through burying my wife and finding a reason to wake up the next morning anyway. I did not confront Claire immediately. Instead, I made a quiet decision. I remembered an old friend from my construction days, a man named Walter Higgins, who had retired from a career in law after starting as a site foreman, just like me. Walter now spent his days consulting on property disputes for elderly clients who had been taken advantage of by family members. I had not spoken to Walter in years, but some friendships, the real ones, do not fade with time. I waited until Claire and Trevor left the house for a business meeting one afternoon. I carefully placed the folder of printed emails into a plastic bag to protect it from the basement's dampness, put on my warmest coat, and walked 8 blocks to the nearest bus stop. I had not left the property in weeks, and the cold winter air felt sharp against my face, but it also felt like freedom. Walter's office was small but welcoming. When I walked in, unannounced, carrying a plastic bag, and wearing an expression Walter had not seen on me in years. He immediately cleared his schedule. He sat me down, made me a warm cup of tea, and listened to the entire story from beginning to end, without interruption. When I finished speaking, Walter was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something I would remember for the rest of my life. He said that what had happened to me was not simply a family disagreement. It was elder financial abuse, a pattern that Walter had unfortunately seen far too many times in his career, always dressed up in the language of family concern, always devastating to the person who had trusted the most. Walter explained that the transfer of the house, while legally completed, could potentially be challenged in court, especially if it could be shown that I had not been given proper legal counsel of my own at the time of signing, and especially with the evidence from those printed emails showing clear premeditated intent to isolate and remove me. It would not be easy. It would take time, patience, and courage. But it was possible. For the first time in months, I felt hope, real hope, not the false comfort I had been giving myself just to survive each day, but genuine hope built on the possibility of justice. That night, walking back from the bus stop toward the house that no longer felt like my own, I stopped under a street lamp and looked up at the window of the basement room where I now slept. I thought about all the years I had spent teaching Claire to be strong, to stand up for herself, to never let anyone walk over her. I realized, with a strange kind of sadness, that somewhere along the way, those same lessons had been twisted and turned against me. Strength, taught with love, had been hijacked by someone else's greed. It was a painful thought, but it also steadied me. If I had taught her to fight for herself, then I still knew how to fight too. I had simply forgotten, for a while, that the lesson applied to me as well. The following days were quiet on the surface, but busy underneath. I began keeping my journal hidden inside an old toolbox in the basement, tucked beneath a false bottom I built myself using skills from decades of construction work. Every evening, after Claire and Trevor had gone upstairs and the house had gone silent, I would sit by the small basement window and write. I wrote about the cold. I wrote about the missed meals. I wrote about the sound of footsteps above me that no longer paused to ask if I was all right. I wrote it all down, not out of bitterness, but because Walter had told me that the truth, written honestly and consistently, carried a weight that memory alone could never hold in a courtroom. Mrs. Patterson became more than a neighbor during this time. She began leaving warm meals by the side basement door twice a week, wrapped in cloth to keep them warm, always timed for moments when Claire and Trevor were away. She never asked me to explain myself. She simply said that she had known Margaret and me for over 20 years, and she was not about to let an old friend go hungry, whatever was happening inside that house. Small acts of kindness like these were what kept me standing during the hardest weeks of my life. They reminded me that I was not invisible, even when my own family treated me as though I were. My brother, once I contacted him, did not hesitate for a single moment. He drove 3 hours the following weekend just to see the basement with his own eyes. He stood in that cold, unfinished room, looked at the cot I had been sleeping on, and felt a fury he had not shown in decades. He hugged me tightly and told me that whatever it took, however long it took, he would stand beside me until this was made right. That kind of support, quiet but unwavering, gave me the strength to keep gathering evidence even on the days when exhaustion and heartbreak made me want to simply give up and accept the basement as my new and permanent reality. Over the next several weeks, I worked closely with Walter, gathering additional evidence. I kept a careful journal documenting the conditions in the basement, the meals I was denied, the isolation I experienced. I reached out quietly to Mrs. Patterson, who agreed to provide a statement about the changes she had witnessed. I even managed to speak with my brother again, who was horrified to learn what had been happening and offered to testify to my character and the close relationship our family once shared. Meanwhile, upstairs, Claire remained unaware that I had discovered the truth. She continued her life as though nothing had changed, occasionally tossing instructions down the basement stairs, occasionally complaining to Trevor about how her father was becoming, in her words, more trouble than he was worth. If you have made it this far into my story, I want you to know something. What I was about to do next was not about revenge. It was about dignity. It was about a man who had given everything to his family finally standing up and saying enough. If you believe every elder deserves that same dignity, make sure you are subscribed, and drop a comment telling me where you are watching this from. Your support truly keeps stories like mine reaching the people who need to hear them. Now, let me tell you how it all unfolded. The court date arrived on a cold morning in late February. I wore my one good suit, the same one I had worn to Margaret's funeral, carefully pressed by Mrs. Patterson, who had become an unexpected source of support throughout the entire ordeal. Walter stood beside me, calm and prepared, carrying a briefcase full of evidence that told a story far more damning than Claire could have anticipated. Claire arrived with a lawyer of her own, a younger man who seemed confident until the emails were presented. The courtroom fell silent as Walter read excerpts aloud, detailing the calculated plan to isolate an elderly man from his community, deny him proper heating and meals, and ultimately push him out of the very home he had spent 30 years building with his own hands. Claire's expression shifted throughout the hearing. At first, defiance. Then, as Mrs. Patterson testified about the changes she witnessed, and as my brother spoke about the man he had always known me to be, generous, hardworking, endlessly devoted to my family, something in Claire's posture began to crack. When it was my turn to speak, the courtroom grew even quieter. I did not raise my voice. I did not point fingers dramatically the way people do in movies. I simply told the truth, plainly and honestly. I spoke about the years of double shifts to pay for Claire's education. I spoke about Margaret's hands stitching late into the night. I spoke about carrying my own suitcases down basement stairs while my daughter watched in silence. I said one sentence that day that would later spread far beyond that courtroom. I said, I did not raise my daughter so that she could inherit a house. I raised her so that she could inherit my values. And somewhere along the way, someone convinced her that a house was worth more than those values. The judge, visibly moved, ruled in my favor. The court found clear evidence of undue influence and financial exploitation surrounding the original property transfer. The ownership of the house was returned to my name. Additionally, given the documented conditions I endured in the basement, the court ordered Claire to cover my medical expenses related to the physical decline I suffered during that period, along with a formal legal separation of financial affairs between my daughter and myself moving forward. Trevor, upon seeing the legal consequences unfolding and fearing further scrutiny into his own financial dealings, disappeared from Claire's life entirely within weeks. The business ventures he had promised would make her wealthy left her instead with debts that were now entirely her own responsibility to bear, no longer able to hide behind her father's assets. Claire, for the first time in over a year, was forced to confront the reality of what she had done, without Trevor's influence clouding her judgment. Outside the courtroom, she approached me, her confident posture from months earlier completely gone, replaced by something that looked almost like the daughter I remembered from her childhood. She tried to apologize, her voice breaking, but I simply looked at her for a long moment before speaking. I told her that I forgave her, because holding on to anger would only poison whatever years I had left. But I also told her that forgiveness did not mean forgetting, and it certainly did not mean returning to how things were before. I told her that trust, once broken this deeply, had to be rebuilt slowly, through actions, not apologies spoken outside a courthouse. I moved back into my home that same week. I walked up the basement stairs one final time, this time carrying my suitcases upward instead of down, and placed the photo of Margaret back on the nightstand where it belonged. I stood in the master bedroom, the one I had shared with my late wife for over 3 decades, and felt something I had not felt in a very long time. I felt like myself again. Mrs. Patterson organized a small gathering of neighbors to welcome me back properly, with warm food and familiar faces filling the living room for the first time in what felt like forever. My brother visited more regularly after that, and slowly, the community that had quietly watched from a distance began weaving itself back into my daily life. As for Claire, she moved into a small apartment across town, taking a modest job to slowly pay down the debts left behind by Trevor's failed ventures. She reached out to me occasionally, tentative phone calls at first, then short visits, always careful, always respectful of the boundaries I had set. It would take years, not months, to rebuild what had been broken. But for the first time since Margaret's passing, I allowed myself to believe that healing, real healing, might actually be possible. I spent my following years differently than I had planned before all of this happened. I began volunteering at a local center that supported elderly individuals navigating family disputes, sharing my story with others who felt too ashamed or too afraid to speak up. I told them what Walter had told me, that what happened to them was not simply a family disagreement. It had a name, and naming it was the first step toward reclaiming their dignity. I often told newcomers to the support group the same words I had spoken in that courtroom, that I did not raise my daughter to inherit a house. I raised her to inherit my values. And I encouraged every person in that room, every parent who had given everything to a child only to be discarded in return, to remember that their worth was never tied to a deed or a signature on a piece of paper. Their worth was in the decades of sacrifice, the early mornings, the late nights, the love poured into another human being long before that person ever had the chance to disappoint them. I have spent the years since then in the home I built, surrounded finally by the respect I always deserved. The basement, once a place of cold isolation, became a small workshop where I teach neighborhood children how to build simple furniture, passing down the same steady hands and patient wisdom that once built an entire life from nothing. My story eventually reached far beyond that quiet street lined with oak trees. It reached families across the country who recognized pieces of their own lives in my words, parents who had given everything, children who had lost their way, and the slow, difficult, but always possible path back toward each other. Because in the end, this was never really a story about a house, or a basement, or even about betrayal. It was about the quiet strength it takes to stand up for your own dignity, even at 72 years old, even when the person hurting you is someone you love more than life itself. It was about understanding that love without respect is not truly love at all, and that sometimes the hardest and most important lesson we teach the people we raise is not through the sacrifices we make for them, but through the boundaries we finally learn to hold. I built a house with my own two hands, brick by brick, over years of quiet sacrifice. But the true legacy I leave behind is not made of walls or a roof. It is made of the courage to reclaim what was taken, the grace to forgive without forgetting, and the unshakable belief that dignity, once nearly lost, can always be found again. If my story touched you the way it touched me while living it, please take a moment right now to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share it with someone who might need this message today. Every single share helps stories like mine reach the people who need to hear them most. Thank you for staying with me until the very end, and I will see you in the next one.